Welcome to the Nantucket Historical Association's Food for Thought lecture series. My name is Jocelyn Wong, and I am the Community Outreach Coordinator here at the NHA. So, resilience has become a hot buzzword in environmental discourse, and our two speakers tonight will examine coastal resilience approaches on a global, regional, and local scale, zooming in on what coastal resilience looks like today on Nantucket. Rachael Freeman is the Director of Environmental and Agricultural Resources for the Nantucket Land Bank. She oversees and participates in planning, project management, and permitting for a variety of environmental topics. She has published on subject matters ranging from habitat management to phenology. Prior to working at the Land Bank, Rachael was the Research Supervisor at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. She also owned and operated Laurentide Environmental, a small environmental consulting company. Rachael holds a master's in plant biology from the University of New Hampshire. Claire Martin earned her degree in media studies, journalism, and digital arts from St. Michael's College in Vermont. She joined the Remain Nantucket team as project manager, where she fosters opportunities for community-led collaborations and oversees communications. She also manages the Envision Resilience Challenge program, a semester-long design studio that connects interdisciplinary university teams with coastal communities to envision adaptive and creative solutions to sea level rise. Prior to joining Remain, Claire served as communications manager for NatureBridge, an organization with campuses in 5 national parks that connects young people to the wonders and science of the natural world. Please welcome Claire and Rachael.
Test. Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. All right. Thank you, Jocelyn. And thank you to the NHA for hosting Food for Thought. We're really thrilled to be here today. Rachael and I are excited to talk about something that we spend a lot of our days thinking about and working on together. This is a conversation that Remain and the Land Bank have been having for quite some time now. And I get the pleasure of working with Rachael quite a bit. And a little bit of a different approach today, different from what you might be used to when it comes to climate change lectures and conversations and presentations. Are not going to be starting with kind of the doom and gloom and estimated inches and feet of water on Nantucket. What we're here to really do is foster an exciting conversation on coastal resilience to get us inspired by it and hopefully have you all leaving here as excited as we are to talk about coastal resilience all the time.
I turned it on.
So why do we need to think about resilience? These are 2 images of Nantucket, 30 years apart. We see on the right the North Shore near Dionis Beach following the 91 no-name storm. And on the left is a picture of the Land Bank's Easy Street Pocket Park in a recent October storm. With quite a bit of water, as we're used to seeing there. We also have Broad Street, which is another place not unfamiliar to increased water. We have Harvey's sandbags outside of the bike shop, kind of always at the ready, and usually dressed up with some lights around Christmas stroll time. So to us, resilience can take on a lot of different meanings. We can see it during these big storm events, but we also see it on a beautiful sunny day in somewhat more subtle ways across the island. So we wanted to start today by taking some hands from the audience about what resilience means to you. What do you think about when you hear the word resilience?
Don't be shy.
Defense.
Defense?
Withstanding a force.
Withstanding a force.
Bouncing back.
Bouncing back.
Bouncing back.
Reeds.
Reeds?
Like a reed in the wind.
Okay.
Increasing longevity.
Longevity? These are all great. This is exactly what resilience means. According to the dictionary definition, it is the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties, the ability to spring back. And when we think about resilience as it relates to coastal resilience, it's really about being flexible, being adaptive. We're not looking at fixed solutions, but really focusing on how we learn to work with nature rather than against it. And so we often come up to two kind of main areas of focus: gray infrastructure and green infrastructure. Often, things like seawalls, hurricane barriers, that really are meant to serve one specific purpose. And what green infrastructure does, these nature-based solutions, it's rather than stopping the water altogether, because we know we can't do that, it looks at ways to mitigate storm surge and work with nature, kind of in coordination. So when we also think about resiliency, it's not about just the infrastructure, but about resilience as a whole. What does it mean to be a resilient community? What does it mean to have resilient people and programs and networks in place so that we can not just recover from these events, but even thrive and be better for it? I also think an important question to ask when we're thinking about this is resilience for whom, and whose voices are at the table when we're thinking about some of these strategies. So we're going to show you a very short clip, just about a minute, but this is from a new series, How to Save a City with Kal Penn. Some of you may know him. He's a famous actor. This clip is featuring someone we think is a real superstar. Her name is Pippa Brashear, and she is the resilience principal and partner at Landscape out of New York City.
So are any of these solutions enough, or is there a reality that we're just going to have to learn how to live with rising sea levels?
We definitely have to learn to live with rising sea levels. How we live on the water is going to have to change. Water levels are going to be higher. We might have to evacuate more. Storms are going to be more often. And I think that the change part is actually the hardest part about designing and planning for climate change, because people want to think there's an infrastructural solution that's going to allow my life to be exactly what it is today, tomorrow. What we really need to do is envision futures with that climate change where we're living and thriving, where there's a high quality of life, and start to give people a picture of that. Life might be different, but we like it. It's something that we're moving towards rather than this scary thing that we're running from. And we as a society, we can step down the risk and think about those other things that we're going to do to adapt and live with a changed future.
So what Pippa says really well is that there is going to be some change. But what I think practitioners like Pippa do, and what we as stewards here on Nantucket hope to do, is showcase how these futures can be seen when we think about coastal resilience adaptation and implementations as additive as opposed to taking away. I think you can't argue with some of those really beautiful design renderings that show up, and starting to imagine how we occupy these spaces and these coastlines in ways that are different, but perhaps more sustainable and maybe even more beautiful. So we're going to now take a look at some regional examples of coastal resilience happening nationwide.
Thanks,
Rachel.
Claire. So Climate Ready Boston is a program based on the city of Boston, and they are looking at how Boston can adapt to climate change. And particularly they have an initiative that works especially with coastal resilience. And one of the things that they've been working on is all these different parks throughout the city and looking at coasts and how they can actually create interesting public spaces where they're drawing people in and allowing them to be floodable, but also protect infrastructure through resiliency practices and create habitat. You're going to sense a theme through a lot of these resiliency projects where we're actually looking at public access and environmental benefit, as well as protection of infrastructure from floods. And so what you can see here is that in the very front, there is public access to waterfront with a floodable deck. A lot of times these are because, okay. A lot of time the decks are used because they are floodable, they're very tolerant of water, and the elevations can be adjusted accordingly to block or allow water to access a park. As you can see, behind the public access waterfront is for storing water, and then we can actually water that floods over the waterfront and the immediate deck in the front can then store water. And then as it backs up, obviously you don't want your baseball field to be covered in water because it's not a very resilient structure. So what they'll do is they'll raise that over time. So we start looking at changes in topography, highs and lows, that allow water to be positioned on a landscape, kind of to some degree where you want it. In addition, I'll add that there's a living shoreline here, which is an infrastructure component that uses some hardscape materials like rocks and plants to create resiliency features. And that is something that we'll be discussing throughout the talk today. We're mentioning living shorelines.
So here's another great example of coastal resilience at work in New York, and this is a project by Scape, who we just mentioned through Pippa. This was actually a outcome, one of the winning projects from Rebuild by Design, developed by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy, which caused extensive damage to all parts of New York, specifically Staten Island, where there were lives lost, lots of infrastructure and damage. And what this project is focused on, it's actually in about halfway through the implementation phase. They broke ground in August of 2021, but they're really recreating a protection system that was once there. So years ago, there was a thriving oyster habitat off the shore of Staten Island that helped with storm surge, slowing wave action, preventing erosion, and due to overharvesting, impacts of climate change that eroded over time, kind of wearing away at that natural protection barrier. So what this project does is recreate that. And, talking about nature-based green solutions, there is a bit of hardscaping in there. They do use enhanced concrete, but also stone that goes maybe 2,000 feet offshore. They use all this computer modeling to find out exactly where it should be in relation to what the projections of sea level rise are. But not only will this slow wave action prevent erosion, maybe even fortify the sand sediment there over time, but it will improve the local biodiversity. They work with the Billion Oyster Project, which is a great program out of New York. They'll bring in SPAC, which is the little seedling for oyster, and eventually not only will oysters come back and repopulate, but other marine biodiversity as well. So I think a big piece of this that is reflective, as Rachel just said, a theme you'll see throughout, is that it's not just the physical resilience of this project where you're having the benefits of slowing storm surge, wave action during storm events. There's also ecological resilience, and then the social resilience is a really great, Scape does a really great job at, is engaging the community. They've been working closely with them since the start of this project in 2014, and there's even a local coalition in Staten Island that provides feedback on the ground regularly and monthly, really incorporating the community voices into the outcomes of this project. So they're about halfway through with installing what you can see there on the left as the living breakwaters.
This is in Cleveland Harbor Eastern Embayment Resilience Strategy, which is known as CHEERS. Again, the reason that we thought this was an interesting project is because it's based in the Great Lakes, so it's not directly on an ocean coast. And as I said before, over 80% in North America is in the Great Lakes, which just makes it an incredibly valuable environmental resource. And they are taking an area that was pretty much commercially developed, and it was really a huge working waterfront, and they're restoring it to be more public access and environmentally friendly. And this is their resiliency project. The other benefit too is that they're adding in components to protect from wave action and storm and ice, which is a big issue along the Great Lakes in the wintertime. So this is one that isn't directly on the coast, but resiliency still plays into these types of environments.
And then here's one last example, and this one's a little bit different. It does include a lot of resilience strategies. This is in Warren, Rhode Island. The strategy it's a plan called Market to Metacom. It's pretty, it's an idea that you can pick from in this kind of suite of adaptation options. It's one that is not implemented very often. In fact, this program is really one of the first in the Northeast region where it's a managed retreat plan, or a proposal, I should say. So under the leadership of the Director of Planning, Bob Ruley, they have put forward from low-lying Market Street, which you can see we're not the only town that has boats out during storm events. This is on their street, going right past one of their local businesses. So it's an area that has mixed use. There's some housing, there's some businesses there. It regularly sees inundation of water from storm surge, rain events, even sunny day flooding. But what's different about this is they've looped it in with an economic redevelopment plan and making use of an old Ocean State job lot site that's only about maybe a half mile inland and upland. But putting that all together, they've put forward proposed voluntary buyouts to the residents and business owners there. It was definitely met with opposition when it was first introduced. I think they've won some people over with the benefits that could come out of a project like this, but I do know there are still some people who will not be taking that buyout. So all part of the difficult conversations that need to happen. So moving on from this and on to Nantucket, we feel very fortunate to be a community that has always showcased resilience, I think, through all of its history in many ways. We are a community that has been able to change and adapt as needed over time. And when it comes to coastal resilience and climate work, I'd argue that we're kind of leading the way throughout the state, and some of the work that's been done under the leadership of so many organizations, specifically Vince Murphy and the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee, who got the Coastal Resilience Plan put forth in 2021. So this is just a great visual. This is certainly not all of the organizations at work here on the island, but that it really needs to be a disciplinary approach.
5 of those slides if we actually started to look at who's working together on these projects, which is fantastic. That's absolutely fabulous. So very grateful. I'm going to talk a little bit about what adaptation could look like today, and starting with the basics. So again, we're kind of here to talk today about what's possibility. What are the possibilities? And adaptation can look like protecting shorelines. It can look like gray infrastructure, levees and seawalls. It can look like green infrastructure, which is habitat restoration and ecotone levees. And when they talk about ecotone levees, it's really a fancy way of saying a dirt berm or a topographic mound. And that's what you're seeing there. And a lot of times what we were describing as which is a combination of gray and green, is when you have this dirt mound, which is acting as a flood barrier. But within the dirt, there's some form of either cement or something that would be considered gray infrastructure that's actually protecting against the flood. So you can combine those two in a lot of different ways. In addition, if you're not going to protect shorelines, you can be accommodating the water, and that's really elevating structures so that you can tolerate water as it moves onto a landscape through structures or around structures and then back out. Last but not least is avoiding a retreat, and this is, as Claire was just mentioning, kind of a tricky topic, and it's difficult to discuss, particularly restricted landmass and extremely expensive real estate. So, either restricting development to areas that are going to be highly flooded or relocating buildings when we need to, or infrastructure to other areas of the island, are difficult discussions that need to be had at some level. This is a more in-depth vision of what adaptation could look like. And starting from the left and working our way to the right, the overall goal of this slide is for everyone to understand that it's going to take a little bit of all of this, right? There's no one answer, and it's going to take a little bit of all of this at many different locations. So it's all about finding what's the best fit. Are we talking about flood warnings and evacuations? Nantucket has a great hazard mitigation plan that addresses that. Are we talking about relocation of anything, parking lots, buildings, infrastructure? Are we talking about elevating buildings or making drainage improvements on existing buildings? Levees, flood walls, and then we get into the nature-based solutions and the green infrastructure where, you could have forests and marshes and barrier islands, broader groins that are being looked at by the town at Sacajah Pond and by the Conservation Foundation at Medowie Creek that are, as Claire was talking about, they're oyster castles, basically. And so there's going to be multiple different components of each of these within any resiliency strategy, and we could see all of them on Nantucket at some level. So the land are both leaning towards green infrastructure. I will say that we definitely have hybrid solutions, but when we're starting to think about resiliency and what it looks like to us on Nantucket, it definitely is focused on emphasis being green infrastructure, creating habitats, creating natural areas, creating public open spaces. And the other thing that is great about green infrastructure is it's extremely flexible. So you can change it over time. And we really think that it can be a near-term adaptation strategy. We don't have to wait 20 years to start looking at how we can use green infrastructure on Nantucket. Actually, you know what, I'm gonna go back for 1 second, because what I wanted to point out here is that this is Easy Street. Claire showed a slide of Broad Street, which was pretty well flooded before. This is right around the corner at Easy Street. This is right around 2019, before the Land Bank put in the Easy Street Park. One thing that came about was that we knew from the get-go when we said, oh, we're gonna put a park here. It was blatantly obvious that it was gonna flood, right? This was no surprise to us. So when we worked with Michael Van Valkenburg Architecture, who actually designed Brooklyn Bridge Park in New York City, you know, we talked about this. We said the overarching factor for this park is that it has to be flood tolerant. It's going to be a floodable space. And so how do we do that? What does that look like? And I kind of joke around that, to be quite honest with you, at the time, I'm not even really sure that I fully understood that we were creating a resilient park, but that's exactly what it is. It can tolerate flooding, and it's adaptable. Boardwalks and the brick design have held up to numerous floods, and the plantings are designed to tolerate flooding. And we weren't sure, is it going to be saltwater flooding? Is it going to be freshwater flooding? Is it going to be both? So we are still adapting over time to see what's living and what's dying. And what we're finding is that actually, you know, based on soil tests, it's really precipitation and stormwater. It's mostly freshwater flooding in that site. We're not getting a ton of salinity in the soils. So the plants that aren't making it are plants that are struggling in the water inundation, but it's freshwater inundation. And we tend to replace with more of what's happy in that environment. So this is the adaptation piece over time. And this is what it is now. It's a floodable public open space. And people all the time say to me, oh my gosh, it's gonna flood. It's the water park. But yeah, that's great. It is. And when it's not flooded, it's a fantastic public open space that people really enjoy. So I'm really proud of this project that we did. Like I said, to me, it was really our first foray into resiliency at the Land Bank. And it's had a really neat outcome, frankly. The next kind of adaptation project that the Land Bank is working on right now is a retreat process, which again, we discussed as being sort of an uncomfortable topic. Cisco Beach is an area along the South Shore with, you know, intense wave action and lots of erosion. And over time, these cars that love to park up front keep getting closer and closer and closer to the ocean. And every winter we say, is this the year we're gonna have to move it? So we're definitely actively working on retreat plans. It's not a place where a living shoreline is going to help. It's not a place, you know, where we have an adaptive strategy which will stop that erosion. So instead, we're really lucky to be able to move it back, to move it north. And this is a situation where we do have the land and the capacity to do this. One thing that's interesting that I actually learned from Vince is that in moving it inland, what we're going to do is we're going to actually flip it so that it's parallel to the road that leads to the parking lot and not parallel to the shoreline. Because if it's parallel to the shoreline, basically you're eroding back a whole entire row of cars. Whereas if it's perpendicular to the shoreline, you know, you're only losing 2 or 3 spaces every time it erodes back if you're actually encountering the parking lot. So it's things like this that are factored into resiliency conversations about all these different projects. We started off today's talk talking about change, and adaptation is change, being flexible is change. And what we're asking is for everyone to, you know, be open-minded to change. We all change every single day and we don't even notice it. And, you know, we talked about resiliency of Nantucketers, and Claire and I were mentioning that this is the perfect place because you can feel the history of Nantucket and the NHA, and you can see how Nantucketers constantly recreated themselves and evolved today, you know, versus where we were when we were whaling. It's an extremely resilient community, and we can continue to evolve. But the one thing that makes it really hard to evolve, and I'm working from the bottom up, is business as usual. If we think we're just going to be able to keep on going on the way we're going on, that's going to make it really hard because it's probably not going to be possible. We're going to have to start making some decisions, which might be difficult, but could also be incredible and provide opportunities, new opportunities. And so that leads to transparent and uncomfortable conversations. Sometimes we might have to have conversations with people where we disagree about things, and yet we really have to reach to see the person's side and to understand how do we come together to make this work, because we have to prioritize projects. We can't always think, I can't always think my house is the most important, or we have to collaborate. We have to collaborate at a broad scale. We have to cross disciplines. We have to cross departments. We have to work private, public, governmental. We have to be able to do all these different things together because that's what is really important. And when we start looking at some other barriers to change, we have a little bit less control over things like regulatory hurdles and permitting. That starts to be issues at the state level and some. But these are all things that are going to have to be talked about. And similarly, funding. Funding is an amazing issue that we could talk about all day because everyone says, well, how are we going to pay for this? And, I don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody has all the answers, but I think if we continue to think about it and see small opportunities and think of ways to come together, we'll continue to take small steps forward and to be able to make these adaptations. And they're exciting. They're really exciting. So I'm going to turn it over to Claire.
Super exciting. There's a lot of opportunity within those. And I want to segue here to, how do we get from business as usual to where we need to be? Remain Nantucket's founder, Wendy Schmidt, has always said, you have to imagine something before you can begin to work toward it. And that was really the inspiration for this Envision Resilience Challenge that we launched here in Nantucket in 2021. This program called on interdisciplinary teams of design students from leading institutions, predominantly from landscape architecture and architecture programs, who we tasked with looking at Nantucket, looking at our history, looking at our culture, looking at our challenges through all kinds of resources and data, but also teaming up with Nantucket advisors, folks on the ground who are experts in all kinds of fields, but could also speak to what it means to be a resident of Nantucket. What does it mean to live here, to occupy the space here? How do you envision your futures on Nantucket? And a lot of our advisors who are part of this are here today. And gave a lot into this project. So I'm just going to show a few examples, and keep in mind that we did not tether these student teams to any of the regulatory permitting, zoning, HGC guidelines. The idea was really think innovative, out of the box, think really visionary, kind of pie in the sky ideas, which you'll clearly see in a moment here, to get us to start to think, how can we envision different futures that are in our own backyard, but are, wow, really cool and creative and beautiful. So this is, skip ahead that one. This is the Yale School of Architecture, and they looked at Nantucket's waterfront, and they took a really deep dive into this history, this really strong history and connection Nantucket has to the working waterfront. From the days of whaling, we've always had this very strong tie to the way in which we live and make money and kind of fuel our economy, and also recreate on the water. So they incorporated that into these very visionary designs that looked at, you can see some of the techniques we've talked about today, living shorelines, submerged dune, where people are occupying these spaces in ways that we might not have imagined before. And beyond that, this Yale School of Architecture team really embraced renewable energy, which is something we're not talking about in today's conversation, but it is an intersecting topic about how we're working to reduce our emissions and thus the impacts of climate change. This was a project called Dwelling on the Edge by the University of Florida, and here you see a little bit more of the built environment, residential, as it relates to our environmental spaces. Jeff Carney is the professor here, and he, on the first day of class, had students go wherever they lived and spend one night outside in a tent and really grounding themselves in that power of place. They did this all virtually through this Nantucket program, but their task was to come up with 3 generations of living in a home on Nantucket. The one here on the bottom, this is a beautiful rendering that might not look like something that might actually happen on Nantucket, but I think what's interesting is that after several generations, this home is designed to eventually kind of give way to nature and to water and become a floodable public. One pretty powerful quote from that team from their presentation that really took a deep dive into our history and culture. And they said, the people of Nantucket will have to sacrifice some of their lifestyles to be able to adapt to the water. From these losses come new ways of living. Ties to nature are as strong as ever. And I'll quickly talk about this, this team. This was actually in year 2 of our program in Narragansett Bay. This is the Syracuse School of Architecture. They looked at an if-then scenario, comparing the towns of Warren, which we just talked about, and Wickford. And so they looked at embracing, retreat and adapt, embrace and engage, and protect and absorb. So again, a lot of these themes that we've talked through today, the various techniques you can take. And out of this one, the top right resonates with me because I think it's something we could all envision here on Nantucket. And lastly, the Northeastern University team put forth a rendering that might be a little bit more implementable. You might see this, something similar in our coastal resilience plan. This was actually adapted by the state of the trustees of reservations State of the Coast report for the islands in 2021. There's some permeable surfaces. They're kind of letting the water come in and learning to work with it through various techniques they've adopted in this model residence. So all this to say, the student ideas are very much grounded in visionary thinking, innovation out of the box, but we think that it can help us get to where we need to be in the future.
I've kind of coined this, I like to say now that we did our own framework plan for Washington Street with Remain, Escape, and this whole group, and the town, and basically, in a way, it was our own resilience, because it has very similar goals, like we talked about before. We're looking to absorb, buffer, and embrace water. We really want to improve the environment. We're looking to cultivate healthy ecosystems here. Being the land bank, one of our major jobs is to bring people into our spaces and create accessible waterfront experiences. We also want to look at critical infrastructure and be realistic about, are there ways within this public park and within this amazing space to actually reduce the possibility of flooding and risk to public infrastructure. And I think most importantly, we want these to be feasible and adaptable and implementable. We don't want to have something that we can't build, and this is where it transitions. True grounding piece. It has to be something that we can build. So that's a goal here. Again, I just want to highlight the work that we have done. This has been very collaborative with the Woods Hole Group and Scape Landscape Architecture. They're both incredible groups to work with. Very much enjoyed our time together. So this is our Envision Resilience Washington Street. This is a resilient Washington Street. And you can see there's a little bit of everything here. There's transitional marshes, there's dunes, there's really interesting ecological habitats, and there's stormwater parks on the inland side to hold our stormwater, as well as, impacting our coastal side. We're like stopping flooding through our boardwalks and changing elevations. And then the boardwalks also provide public access for people to access this waterfront property. So there's a little bit of everything here, and this is thinking, what could it be like? One of the reasons that we chose Washington Street, and this is really critical, is because Washington Street is really our truck route right now, from the Steamship Authority to to Mid-Island on Nantucket. And it floods, and that's major, because that completely arrests the ability of movement of goods and people from the Steamship Authority to Mid-Island. The other piece about Washington Street that's interesting and in some ways convenient is that both the land bank and the town are majority stakeholders in the area, so we can work together to see opportunities on our properties. I wanted to point this out. This is a cross section actually, and this is sort of in our framework plan. We were looking at exactly what these boardwalks look like, right? Because I told you the boardwalk is really the last line of defense from coming up and over. And so there's changes in topography, and then you hit the boardwalk. And this is actually really well illustrated in the cross-section that you can see here. And I am going to get a little boring for a minute, and I am going to talk about modeling, but I just kind of help myself. And how we actually got to these designs, because there's a huge amount of math and really interesting work that is underpinning all of them. So when we look at this, what you can see is if you start at the ocean side, you see these, different years. You see 2030, 2050, and 2070. And what's been modeled is basically what they think high tide will be, mean high water. What's high tide going to be at these different years? And the thing that we start to look at is, okay, so by 2070, high tide might be, elevation 6. Okay, so where are we now, right? And where do we want to be? So where do we want that boardwalk to be? And what do we want the design flood elevation to be, which is where we came up with this example. And this is for 66 Washington Street. So basically that boardwalk is at elevation 9. And therefore, even on a high tide flood day in 2070, theoretically, if sea level rise predictions are accurate, it should stop that high tide flooding. So it wouldn't be nuisance flooding on a daily basis. What you can see here is that on this cross section is that you've got actually increased, increased height along the length of the entire dune. So starting on the side here, this is raised up and you have a dune berm, right? And then it goes up into a dune face, which is a little bit higher, the dune crest. And then this is the boardwalk, which is really a multi-use path in this design. And it's meant to stop water from the coastal side. However, if water does come over and access here, you have a swale or a low-lying area to trap some of the additional water. And this is really all designed in order to protect Washington Street, to stop coastal flooding coming from here, come up and over, and flood Washington Street. So this is one way that can be looked at, is in the cross-section. This is actually the more beautiful version of the cross-section, and a lot of times the more accessible version. So what you can see up top is the mean high water without the project. So say we didn't do anything. We didn't change any topography. We just let sea level rise happen. And what you see is you actually have flooding that happens. And then, it covers Washington Street. And this is predicted to be in 2050. Whereas if you actually raised that beach, as we discussed, created a dune berm and a multi-use path, this is also at mean high water, but here simply because that area has been raised. What you can't see right over here on the backside is that swale, which is the low area, which is kind of left over there to trap water. So, honestly, who wouldn't want the bottom? Yes. Yes. Yep. So, in theory, who wouldn't want it? It's a publicly accessible open space. Okay, now I'm delving into the math for a second. I love the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model. It was developed by Woods Hole Group, and it was developed for Mass DOT, the Department of Transportation. And basically, Mass DOT realized, they said, oh no, we have a problem here. We have so much critical infrastructure in and around the state, particularly in Boston. How are we going to know where the water is coming from, whether something's going to be flooded, like the central artery, how much water is going to be in that tunnel, and how long it's going to be there for? How can we figure this out? And they worked with the Woods Hole Group to create this flood risk model. And the flood risk model incorporates tons of storm events from historic storms going quite way back and all related to Massachusetts. And then all the components of these storms, wave action, wave height, wind, everything. You can think of it, it is in this model. And what they've been able to do is come up with a really high resolution model. That's the other thing that's unique about the coastal flood risk model that they generated, is that it's very high resolution. So you can actually look quite closely at how a specific building is going to be impacted in Massachusetts. And this is where we get our water levels that we're using for some of these designs, right? This is where we get our design flood elevation. So we say, this is where we want to be. Are looking, these are all pretty coming up quickly, but we might say, we really, for this site, want to achieve a design flood elevation that's going to be tolerate 2100, till 2100, we're going to be able to tolerate daily high tide flooding on this site. And it allows us to make that selection from these numbers. Here's an example of how these numbers are used. So, and basically what the model produces. So what you have over here is these are flood extents, and where the white arrows are actually flood pathways. That's what we refer to them as. And this is a model where they're looking at a 50% storm, which is actually a storm that could occur every 2 years in 2030. It's 50% chance of it happening here. In the left panel, this is without any of that boardwalking that we just described in our Envision Resilience Washington Street. Whereas in the right panel, we have the boardwalking in place. And so what it really is you can simplify it and think of the boardwalking as a topographic change, right? You have a 9-foot elevation in the one that says long-term framework, and you don't in the existing conditions. So what does that do? In the existing conditions, when you model that storm event, basically you're getting places like right here or right here where you're seeing waters accessing the site and then creeping around the corner. And then in the long-term framework, when you could put that boardwalk in, you see that you don't have that along here. So this is how this iterative design process happens. So we say, okay, so what if we put, this height boardwalk in, and what if we put it in over here, right? And then you model it and you see where your flood pathways are going. Long-term framework, you notice that up here by Commercial Street, you still have a flood pathway. So then you say, okay, so what are we going to do about that, right? And you start this iterative process of design, review, model, discussion, followed by design, which is how we end up with these designs. We decided to dive a little deeper into Washington Street and Francis Street, which is an area that's been really interesting to work with Remain on, in particular in the town and the land bank. And we have a lot of property in this area. Interestingly enough, the land bank owns this and this site, while the town owns the area with the kayak rental, Salt Marsh Center, and the parking lot behind. So there's a lot of co-ownership in there. And we've been working again with Scape and Witt's whole group and Remain to come up with an interesting design that will be implementable on this site. And as you can see, we're just getting smaller and smaller and smaller here. So we're getting... and this is where we got to. We basically have similar systems that you've seen in our Envision Washington Street design, but we have a recreational beach with a beach deck. Notice the +8, right? So you have that high level of protection from flooding. And then you have +7 in some of these dune systems. And then you have stormwater retention areas across the street that will allow you to hold stormwater when the tide is too high for the stormwater to release into the harbor. And this is entirely ADA accessible, so it's fostering public access, we're creating habitat, and we are hopefully reducing flooding in this area because this is pretty much a flood pathway. This one corner between Francis and Washington Street floods incredibly, both from stormwater and from the ocean, and it's often underwater. So we'd like to improve the situation. Yeah. Uh-huh. Oh, interesting. Okay. This is something that we've discussed a lot. So do you see this little notation up here? This is actually what's called a vertical datum called NAV E88, right? Vertical datums are used as reference points. And so there is a 0 somewhere in the world, it's actually, that, right, that everyone knows is 0, okay? And they use it as a reference point all around the world for this vertical datum. What it actually translates into for us on Nantucket is +8 is actually about 4 feet. So that +8 boardwalk is probably, about here on me if I was standing on Washington Street. Got it? We we debated talking about that? We said we'll address it if somebody asks. Let's see. Our ground zero, is closer. It's closer to kind of 4-ish in this area. But yes, and it varies, and you can't say zero. It would be great if zero was always mean sea level, but it's not. So it's this arbitrary created, kind of like it's new. If it was new. Yeah, exactly. It's so that everyone can talk about these things around the world and still have the same sense. It's a universal system, basically. So then we can get to the pretty picture. So this is a rendering, again, by Scape, where they're just showing what a freshwater wetland boardwalk and space could look like. We could have a lot of great habitat and native plants, and we could create additional spaces, but they can also flood. It doesn't mean they're going to be wet all the time by any means, but it's okay if they are. And we're encouraging the water, and we're encouraging it to be a place where water can sit while the tide goes out and the storm recedes, so that we're able to accommodate. So is access for people and inviting people into these spaces. On the ocean side, we have the sea raised, to either 8 or 4, depending on how you want to think about it. And there's a beach, and we'd retain the kayak rental location, which is incredibly popular, and dune plantings, also incorporating habitat into this area. And so then we get to this, which is what Claire and I like to think as, why isn't resiliency great? Like, look at this. Wouldn't this be possible? So this is when we really start to think maybe adaptation could be a great thing for Nantucket, and maybe there's a lot of possibility, and it could be beautiful, and they could be amazing public open spaces, and maybe there's something to this resiliency stuff. So I want to thank you so much. I also want to thank the NHA for hosting us tonight, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Claire, Rachel. We'll now move into our Q&A. So if you have a question for them, please raise your hand and wait until a mic gets to you.
I think it was a really good presentation. I really appreciate it a lot. I don't know if this is a question for you, although you have to come up against it. You've talked a lot about the public spaces and the partnerships between the organizations that own property and how they want to make it better. But to me, it seems like our biggest challenge is not the public spaces, it's the private spaces. You made the point that this island property is worth gazillions of dollars, and every year when they put things up for vote about how to limit or how to corral, it never goes anywhere because the real estate market is huge and a whole lot of people on this island live through the real estate. So are you reaching out in any way to have these conversations with the people that are actually selling and renting houses? Because they're doing great and they really don't want it to change. That was my concern.
Question. I'll add what that's it for me. That's a great question. It's probably one that's difficult for both of us to answer. I can share an anecdote from an advisor who worked with us in the Envision Resilience Challenge, who is a local real estate agent on the island. And, I think it's hard to cast a wide net on real estate agents as a whole. This specific person, was having conversations with buyers about what the reality of their properties would look like with all of the projections that we know from rising sea levels that we can see today during winter storm events. And for a lot of people, they were okay with purchasing a 10-year rental, knowing that a home on the South Shore, for example, might only have the longevity of 10, maybe 20 years. I know that's not answering your question, but I think that's so from this real estate agent's perspective and experience in working with those who are buying homes on the island, a lot of those individuals who are buying these waterfront homes that might be at risk on the South Shore, or maybe in some communities where it's very low lying, they're experiencing a lot of storm surge, a lot of inundation of water, it didn't deter them from making that purchase, let's say, despite whatever price tag might be associated with that house, and given the facts that, you know, you're going to see a lot of increased water on your property if it's business as usual, and if we don't implement a lot of these changes, or you're And I think to answer that these kinds of conversations where we're talking on the community, do I have the clicker? That I skipped over because it's a little blurry. This is from the Yale, this image on the right, this was part of the Yale School of Architecture's presentation. And so again, it's going back. And my favorite is the bottom piece, you know, so we're kind of moving away from more gray infrastructure, moving away from fossil fuels. It's the holistic approach of how do we envision a more sustainable future, you know, that's going to call for softer edges, different housing typologies. But I think what's most important is the way we think about community. And if, you know, I think what we're discussing here is probably closer to that, you know, little icon on the left where the people are kind of separate and thinking about their own private spaces. How do we think about it in a community sense that you have here? So they looked at this as a new community model. I think that's a lot more difficult in practice, but you know, we have a strong community here in Nantucket that I think, if up to the challenge, could be capable of some of these.
Rachel, my question is, how good is the modeling? Like, does it account for any sand movement on Nantucket? Is it specific to Nantucket? Does it account for, like, in 2060 if the haulover blew out like it did in the early 1800s? Does it account for, like, CO2 washing away? Like, as a community, into actually modeling really specifically Nantucket and the hydrology and how sand moves around the island?
Based on the design side of things, that the benefit and why we emphasize the green infrastructure solutions are because they're more flexible. If you build a seawall that's only designed to keep out, let's just say 7 feet of sea level rise, and all of a sudden it's 2075 and you have 10 feet, well, the wall is now obsolete. So with these green infrastructure solutions, they're a little bit more flexible. You know, if there's a catastrophic event like the break of the haulover, I don't know how quickly you could change this design, but they are meant to be flexible and kind of change and adapt as the projections and modeling becomes real time.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel and Claire, for spending your evening with us and shedding light on coastal resilience initiatives on the island. One last round of applause for our speakers. So I just want to thank our NHA members and the Tuppence C. Harris Foundation for making this lecture series possible. Also, thank you to our audience for joining us today.